Thanks, Ron, and thanks to Joe for the invitation. It's an honour and a privilege to be here. PIIGS, you've heard it mentioned already today: Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Greece and Spain. PIGS, it's an impolite and not very nice term that was coined by a financier to describe the 5 European countries that are in most difficulty and are in most danger of getting into an even worse situation. I'd like to do 3 things today. One is to convince you, if you need convincing, that it is not unfair that Ireland is included in those badly governed countries. 2, to say that the reason our system of governance is bad is different from those 4 countries, and it's different in the way that our problems are institutional, whereas those countries have chronically bad, dysfunctional political cultures. And that's a very good thing, because it's much easier to change institutions than to change culture. And the third thing is to say exactly what those institutional changes are, the sort of catalyst the gentleman over there was asking for that might change things. A caveat first. Government is a messy business. Politicians have a difficult job. They are bombarded by information. They have to make a lot of decisions over a short period of time. People are bending their ears. It's a difficult thing to do. And it's becoming more difficult. As the world becomes more complex, our economies, our societies, there are more things to do, and it's more difficult to do them. The current economic crisis is a very good example of that. Nobody foresaw that there would be a financial collapse and recession of the kind that we've seen. Absolutely nobody. And the reason for that is that nobody fully understands how the financial system works. The financial system has become an enormously complex entity. There are many different parts of it, and it interacts in different ways. And truly, there is nobody who fully understands how that works. And because nobody understands how it works, nobody foresaw that things would happen as they happen. Nobody saw those really serious structural problems within it that led to the disaster that we've seen. Here at home, and it's come up today, and I'm sure it's come up many times during the week, the issue of the liability guarantee by this government in this country. We saw the documents that have come out have often shown the degree of almost panic that there was, of uncertainty, of different advice. Some people say, why was some advice ignored? Well, you've got to decide in a course of action. Some advice was always going to be ignored because there were different options. It was a complicated thing to do, and there was panic, and the costs of not doing something were enormous. The financial system came very close to a complete meltdown. The entire system, it wasn't just that we wouldn't have credit, we wouldn't have had a payment system. It was very close to the entire payment system shutting down, and not only here, in other countries as well. So that just gives some idea. I don't want to sound like a sort of media commentator who can comment from a high perch and that there's an easy way to do things and it's all simple. It's not. It is very difficult. That said, I'd like to go through, we really do need to try and measure how effective government is and how governments perform. And I think we've got a lot of measures to do that. And it has to be comparative. We've got to look at what other countries do and how other countries have performed. And I'd like to go through a whole ream of things to show that we're seriously underperforming in the way that we govern, and that we can do an awful lot better. And that the main reason that we're underperforming is not because we're doing bad things, but because there are so many things that we're not doing at all. So it's a question of inertia, inaction, and that great phrase, I think, maybe coined here, that of this implementation deficit disorder that is particularly acute in this country. We can start with the current crisis. I don't think there's a need to go into it in great detail, but we've spoken about it in many sessions. But if we look at the depth of the recession in this country, it is deeper than any other developed country. At this point, 1 in 8 jobs have disappeared, and that is the biggest shock of employment that any country in the rich world has suffered, and it's continuing. It's still getting worse. So it's been a profoundly deep crisis. I think if you look across 3 areas of government inaction that contributed enormously to the depth of the crisis. The first was a financial regulator that was in a deep sleep for a long period of time. The second was successive finance ministers and Department of Finance that didn't put in place the sort of mechanisms that would have prevented the kind of public finances crisis for the second time in a generation that we're now undergoing. And the third thing is that the whole system of government didn't focus on a competitiveness agenda that other institutions of the state were saying is clearly there, that needed to be addressed, and that as a small open economy we had to maintain competitiveness. That was an imperative, and that was not done to the extent that it should have been done. So 3 areas of inaction all contributed to making the economic crisis that we're suffering much deeper and more profound than in many other countries. Let's roll back to the 1980s. At the end of the 70s, many countries got into trouble. We got into more trouble than most countries, and again, it was a question of inaction. We didn't get to grips with the problem of our budget. By the middle of the 1980s, we were the only country in the OECD, the rich world, to have a budget deficit the size of our economy. No other country had lost control of the public finances to the extent that we had. Now, it took until the late 1980s before we got to grips with that problem, but the cost, the human cost, was enormous. Immigration, and joblessness over that period. And it's important to remember that in the rest of Europe and North America, the middle of the 80s was a boom time. It was a very successful period. Yet we were going through this self-inflicted recession because we didn't act to get to grips with our problems. Let's go back to the 50s. And again, we've had 3 periods of economic underperformance over the past 60 years that compare very badly with every other country. Now, we don't have economic data going back to the 1950s. We do have population data. And there is not any other country in Western Europe that saw a decline in its population between 1950 and 1960. Every country saw an increase in its population. There was a baby boom. There was a post-war boom. Countries that stayed out of the Second World War, Sweden and Switzerland, were particularly well placed. Their productive capacity was intact and they were well placed to service that reconstruction period. We were also in that position. But what did we do? Well, in the 1930s we decided to go protectionist, as everyone else did. But after the Second World War, all democracies in Europe said, okay, that doesn't work. We need to open up. We were the only democracy in Western Europe to decide, no, we're going to keep the barriers up and we're not going to liberalize. It took 15 years before we decided to move in that direction, and again, the cost was huge. So it was this failure to act and to get to grips with the problem and see that there was a problem and something needed to change, this inertia that seems to be so strong in the system. There are a whole bunch of other ways to measure this performance. One is to look at how our civil service works, and it's almost a laboratory because we had the same civil service structures as Britain until 1922 when we parted ways. So if we compare what the British civil service looks like today and what the Irish civil service looks like today, we see a big gap in how they've been reformed. And I'd add that I'm not saying that the British system is good. I've lived in Britain for 9 years, and there are a lot of things that are bad about Britain and things that are certainly not a model. The point here is to say we started from the same point, and where are the 2 countries now? So we look at something like recruitment. Recruitment procedures in the civil service and public civil service here are still largely as they've been for many years. In Britain, they said, okay, we need, in a modern, complex environment, we need to get people into different points in the service at different times. We need to do it quickly, and we need to deploy those resources. So they have a fast-track recruitment. They call it a high-flyer recruitment process to get people in so they have the human resources in the system so that that they're aware of things and they can adapt quickly. The openness of senior appointments. I saw the British ambassador around here the other day. His new boss was appointed this week, and the guy who's the new boss of the Foreign Office is not a diplomat. He was a long time ago, but he's been doing other things. He was in Brussels for 5 years. The British government decided, okay, we want to change the direction or the emphasis in British foreign policy, and we want to put somebody who's got a good background in trade, as the new boss at the Foreign Office has. So they put this guy in. Now, it's absolutely unthinkable here that you would have a non-lifer from the Department of Foreign Affairs made head of Foreign Affairs. It just would not happen. It's just wouldn't even be considered. If also we look at the way you manage public policy, many areas of public policy now have links between different departments. So it's very important to link them up. So what the British have done is they've put in strategy units where they have people focused on a particular issue and they draw the different departments together. And they have these implementation units where they again push these issues, any policy issue that has this sort of cross-cutting element to it. So they try and drive it that way. who was it last night? Sean O'Driscoll was saying that his experience of dealing with the public service was this extreme siloization where people don't even know each other. So you don't have that kind of cross-cutting push. So things have changed very little, and in many ways the civil service today looks more like Whitehall in the 1950s or even before that. So little change has there been. Other ways of looking at it, environment, in a lot of EU ways. We do an awful lot together in the EU, and a lot of this we can measure how countries perform. One thing is the environment. Most environmental legislation and rules come from Brussels, and we agree these rules in Brussels. So what about implementation? Well, a report out recently that looked at quality of our bathing water. So they took samples from all over Europe, thousands of samples. In Ireland, there were 4 times more samples that failed the test than the European average, and only one country had a worse record. So we have the rules, but again, we're not pushing to implement them, which is important for people who are using them and for our tourism industry. Another something that you've got a good comparison on is health service. Health services spend a huge amount of money on pharmaceuticals every year, and because governments are the big purchasers of pharmaceuticals in Europe, they want to squeeze the bill. They want to pay less to pharmaceutical companies. So what do? Well, one of the key things they do is they say, if we see a generic drug, that's a non-branded drug, and we compare it to a branded drug, the difference can be 1/10 of the price. So they say, anywhere and everywhere, we want to buy the generic drug. It gives people exactly the same quality of treatment, but we save a lot of money. Guess which country in Europe uses generics least? This country. Department of Health has not pushed this agenda to try and cut the cost of spending money. Now, pharmaceutical companies make a big contribution to this country, but I don't think anybody thinks it should be, the Irish taxpayer should be subsidising big pharmaceutical companies. It's just not what we should be doing. And there are huge savings to be made by squeezing the budget of pharmaceuticals here if there was a push to do so, if there was a recognition that this was something we should do and push for it. And just again, it happens, but it happens slowly, much more slowly than other countries. A final example. A couple of years ago, the European Commission went around to all the finance ministries in Europe and asked them, sent them out a checklist and asked them to tick off what the sort of best practices in various areas are. And the Department of Finance came back, and of the 19 finance ministries that sent a reply to this, the finance ministry that had least in the way of best practice and nothing in the way of alarm bells that would ring if there was a problem on the horizon was Ireland. That was 3 years ago. Last year, we had the biggest budget deficit in Europe. So this was a pretty good indicator of how things were going to go. And again, why wasn't the Department of Finance moving towards implementing this best practice when the times were good? Why wasn't there a push to do what was, in many cases, not even politically difficult? It was just to put in place various measures that would set alarm bells ringing, that would make sure that money is spent more efficiently, but it just didn't happen. So there's a whole range of areas where you can measure pretty well how we perform relative to other countries. And when you see underperformance here, it tends to be because just something doesn't get done. There's just no pressure for change. So why is this, and how does it happen? I think it's worth comparing Ireland with the Portugal, Italy, Greece and Spain countries in terms of those sort of outcomes to see why it happens. I've lived in 3 Mediterranean countries, and in the previous job spent a huge amount of time going to countries and trying to understand how they work and comparing them. And it's certainly something that I noticed without doubt amongst politicians in southern European countries was the naked cynicism and outright corruption that went on, very blatant corruption that went on, very little civic mindedness among Latin American politicians, Southern European politicians. There's a lot wrong with our politicians, but there's just no comparison between Southern European politicians and Irish politicians. And any sort of survey show that Irish politics is actually pretty clean compared to not only Southern Europe, but most other countries in the world. So our politicians may have a lot there may be a lot wrong, but corruption is not something they're guilty of. Now, that's not to say there's no corruption. In every country, there's problems with campaign financing, with influence peddling. Of course there is. But relative to other countries, this is not a corrupt country. So our problems are not that our politicians are busily enriching themselves and damaging everyone else. It's that they're just not doing anything at all. So why is this, and what are the institutional problems creating this? Well, I think there are two big things that really stand out about our constitutional architecture that is very different from other countries. The first part is how we form our cabinets, our governments. Let me just stand back and sort of give just a very brief sort of few thoughts on this. The size of the state has been growing, not just in recent decades, but this is a very long-term historical process over hundreds of years, and it's been becoming more powerful. In the 18th century, people started thinking about what to do about this as the state became ever more powerful, and that source of power was something that was destabilizing. It meant that individual liberties could easily be trampled on. So political thinkers decided, let's take this power and just cut it into three. So cut the state power into three parts. You've got judiciary, you've got a government executive, and you've got parliament. And by doing that, you'd have the three parts pressing against each other, checking each other, balancing each other, and that way the whole system would maintain this sort of gravitational coherence and at the same time not be a threat to citizens, but serve citizens by doing things effectively. Now, that was probably the most important political concept that has ever been, and it is a big concept, and most countries that adopted this into their constitutional frameworks did it after a period of rupture, either invasion from without or revolution from within. So the US being a good example, that when its constitution, it saw this idea of the separation of powers as being absolutely crucial. And we see that today. Barack Obama was a member of the US Parliament, and he had to resign to take up the presidency. He then went to Hillary Clinton and said, Hillary, do you want to be my foreign minister? She said yes, but she had to decide between staying on as a senator and taking that job, because the Americans are very clear, and have always been clear, that you can't have a system where you are both a member of Parliament and a member of the government. It doesn't work, and there are a number of reasons for that. I'd like to come to that. Where are we in Ireland? Well, we inherited the British system, and the British system is very unusual, because Britain has had an extraordinarily calm and gentle evolution in its political history. There hasn't been any real serious political upheaval in Britain since the 17th century. So things were already on an evolutionary track in Britain before the doctrine of separation of powers evolved. And they never had the kind of rupture subsequently that would have meant them starting with a blank sheet of paper and saying, let's redesign our constitutional framework. British Constitution is a higgledy-piggledy crazy thing. You wouldn't design it that way in a million years. It's a little like a medieval urban centre that, it's just grown bits and pieces. There's wide streets, narrow streets. There's all sorts of strange aspects to it. So it's a very unusual structure. And one of its most unusual structures, compared to today, is that it collapses two branches of government together. Parliament and executive are one. So many people in Britain worry about this, and they say that Parliament is impotent, as many people here do as well. Now, we inherited that system where we essentially merged the two, but we went one step further. We actually made our system more Westminster than Westminster itself by formalizing in our Constitution that effectively almost nobody can be a member of the government without being a TD. There's a provision you can have two senators, but it's never been used. So effectively, we have completely merged the two branches of government. So what does that mean? Well, it means that the only people we can have as ministers are about 100 people on the government benches. Those people are extremely busy because of their TDs, and the electoral system keeps them even busier. We'll come to that in a moment. They are party politicians who are ambitious and want to get ahead in their party, so they're working that angle as well. And now they're very involved in the media in order to keep their profile high. So they've got three pretty much full-time jobs, and they're trying to be ministers. Now, my view is that there's absolutely no way, even the most gifted individual, can find the time to know what he wants to do, or she, know what they want to do in a ministry, think it through, drive policy day in, day out, bring the sort of pressure that you need from the top to get things done. That it's simply not possible in the system we have, given the tiny pool of people we have to choose from, and given all of the constraints that they have to work with. It's just not possible. And because we have the system we have, it leads to the kind of inertia where there is no drive for change, nor is there any incentive for change. A politician here who takes a job in a department doesn't always have any incentive to bring about change. He's not going to get re-elected. It's not going to mean much to his constituents. That is not the incentive that would drive a politician in many other countries. So what to do about it? Well, it would seem to me that the vast majority of democracies do it that way. They say, look, you have a choice between being a TD and being a minister, and that you separate them. And by changing our constitution and saying, we do it as most other democracies do it, we take out a huge amount of that. We squeeze out a lot of that inertia, and we get ministers who are full-time ministers. They go to the department in the morning, they stay there all day, they're focused on that all the time, as opposed to permanently trying to get themselves re-elected, being in the media, trying to work their way up the party through their parties. And that gets people focused on actually getting a job done. I think it's not only an effectiveness thing. One of the reasons why there's a separation of powers is because it also makes people more accountable. Now I know that may sound strange to some people, because often discussing this in the past, I've heard people say, but isn't it undemocratic to have ministers who aren't elected? And everybody else says, no, it's actually more, it makes them more accountable. And think of it in this way, that if a minister, we take anybody in our current system who's part of a political process, his own party is in power, he sits on the benches with them. If he messes up, all of those people have an incentive to support him. He's one of their own. Now, if you do it as most other countries do it, and you appoint somebody like Patrick Honohan to the finance ministry, and he is the classic, I've often sat around in conferences in other European countries, he is the classic type of person that people appoint as a finance minister. They appoint him as finance minister, he gets dragged into Parliament every week. All of the parliamentarians, be they opposition or the same side, grill him. The government parliamentarians see him and say, okay, he's not one of our own. If he's not delivering for us, we give him a grilling, and then we get rid of him if we don't like him. I'll give an example that occurred to me during the week of how that might work. There was a report out about how the government reacted to the severe weather conditions earlier in the year. At that time, Noel Dempsey was the transport minister, a man for whom I hold in very high regard. I think he's a very smart man. He was on his holidays at the time, and he decided he wasn't going to come back. Now, in other countries, if you had a minister who was appointed to do the job, some sort of transport, like I mentioned, Andrew Adonis was mentioned as somebody who was put in to do a job. He was in the UK, he was a transport expert, so they put him into that job. Now, in most countries, if the Prime Minister had called him up and said, I want you back here to do your job, there's a crisis, I want you to be seen here, he would come back on the double, because the Prime Minister would be in a very good position to fire him if he didn't do what he was told. Now, there was absolutely no way Brian Cowen was in any position to fire Noel Dempsey. Noel Dempsey is far too powerful. He could go to the backbenches and cause trouble, or even worse, he could resign the whip and go rogue. And he could be an independent and Fianna Fáil lose something. He runs such a good operation in Meath that he'd absolutely, almost certainly, maintain that seat, and Fianna Fáil would lose a seat. So you actually make government more accountable if you take it out of, separate Parliament from government. And that is what most people do, and I think we need to very actively consider doing that and making the Constitution much more like others. To finish, the second big and unusual aspect, it's been touched on a lot, so I don't think there's much need to go into it in huge depth, and that's the way we choose our TDs as opposed to how we choose our ministers. As we all know, the electoral system is almost unique. Only tiny Malta has it. I think there are limited parallels with Malta. I lived there for 2 years, and it's a very different country in many ways. But the Jolie is somebody who I'd would hesitate to disagree with, but the professor earlier on said that he felt there was no link between the electoral system, or no proven link between the electoral system and how government performs. Well, I would very respectfully disagree, and here's why. Having met politicians all over Europe and some further afield, and having met a lot of politicians here, I've often had politicians here say, oh, we're just messenger boys. We're delivery boys. Now, I have never, ever heard a politician in any other country say that. And the reason is because they're not delivery boys. That's not what they do. Our electoral system makes our elected representatives into delivery boys. Now, we can have that system, and in some ways there's advantages to that system. If we want our elected representatives more or less to be ombudsmen between us and the state and the institutions of the state, well, okay. But let's not complain because they're so distracted doing that when they're not doing the other things that they should be doing. And that's a price we have to pay. So if we want a slightly more withdrawn political system where politicians focus more on big issues, there will be a price to be paid in the sense that they're not going to be, all of them, at our beck and call. And what I would suggest we do is, let's go to halfway house. As the professor said, it's a system that's considered to be fair and we're familiar with it, so let's keep it, but for half TDs. And then have the other half elected with a national list, so that we have a national constituency. Those TDs are less attached to any particular geographic location, and they have more time to do things. So we keep our old system, and we introduce another in parallel. Now, there's no such thing as a perfect electoral system. I'm not saying that this will change everything, but there very clearly, to my mind, is a big gap between our electoral system and the outcomes we get from it, the localism, the lack of focus on bigger issues, and that if that's not addressed, that's going to contribute to that inertia, continue to contribute to that inertia problem, where you just don't get that push to get things done on a national level. So, overall, it seems to me that there is a real potential to change things here. In many of the Latin American countries, those sort of deep cultural attitudes towards the wielding of power are just not things that can get changed easily. Here, changing your constitution is a much simpler affair, and particularly when you're doing things that are pretty unradical and in many ways de-radicalizing the constitution to make it more like other constitutions. And by doing that, it seems to me that there's a huge potential to squeeze that inertia out of the system and to bring the sort of people into government that can drive the country, because there are an awful lot of civic-minded people in this country. There is a decent political culture. I disagree with people who say there's not. And there is a huge potential to unlock those sort of things that this country has: high levels of education, a stable political system, stable society, a moderate society. Doing that, getting our political institutions right, we can unlock that, and I think there's a huge potential to do that and not to have the kind of crisis that we've had in the past and we're having today. Thank you.